Yeah, thank you very much, Lasky Herlock. Yes, Lasky Herlock, I suppose as many speakers have said before me, and it is quite clear that this is absolutely one of the most transformative pieces of climate action legislation. And it's probably one of the most transformative pieces of legislation that's gone through the Oireachtas in the last couple of years as well. And I think that's very important to recognise and acknowledge that. I'd also like to pay tribute to the chairperson of the Climate Action Committee, Deputy Brian Ledden TD, who has done a very important job in steering this legislation through the committee over the last couple of months to get it to where it is today. And I'd also like to pay tribute to my colleague Senator Pauline O'Reilly as well, who's been extremely helpful in assisting Deputy Ledden with that and assisting other government members of the committee, particularly making sure we're there for votes as well when people like myself were coming late. So I really want to pay acknowledgement to that. But this legislation today as well, Minister, is actually a great day for the Green Party and their involvement in the government. And it really shows the importance of why every politician in any functioning democracy should strive to get into government, because it's an opportunity to actually implement and to advocate for the policies and manifestos that people have been campaigning upon for decades. And you've seen that coming from this government in recent months. It's not just green fingerprints on legislation. You know, it's green policies coming out left, right and centre from this government, and that's because of the addition of the Green Party in government. And we saw it today, for example, with the announcement of safe cycle routes to schools. The last year of this committee in particular for me has been quite a steep learning curve. You're coming into a committee as a first-time member of the Oireachtas with people who are on the committee who have a lifetime of work dedicated to climate action. People who are talking about climate change and the whole process even long before I was born. So that is a bit of a challenge when you're coming into it as such a new member of the Oireachtas but it's been a real great learning curve to be able to sit there, to be able to listen, to be able to learn at the same time, and it's been a real joy. A bit like the Scottish legislation, and we discussed this in detail in our committee, I really do believe that this legislation can be the gold standard of climate action legislation, that other countries in the world will be able to look to Ireland as that shining example of what type of legislation that they need to introduce. And I accept the point that Senator McDougall made earlier on, but I just think because other countries aren't pulling their weight isn't a good enough excuse for Ireland not to be ambitious, isn't a good enough excuse not for Ireland to have some of the most ambitious climate action legislation. Let's be that shining example to try, and at least if it's to guilt trip or to bring others along in other democracies, to bring them along with us. And that's the whole point of why this statutory framework is actually so important. Perhaps one of the best examples of amendments that came along was the amendments to make the language much more specific in this legislation. And that's actually quite a key part of this, where accountability actually runs through this legislation, through every sentence, through every paragraph. Accountability is a really key cornerstone. And I just want to take this opportunity to outline a couple of the points of accountability in it that I think are really important. Firstly is the introduction of the legal requirement for the government to adopt the series of 3 successive 5-year plans, economy-wide plans for each sector. That's really a whole-of-government approach towards this. It's a whole societal approach towards it. And we're setting very clear and very achievable targets, and we're showing people how we achieve those targets as well. The second thing is the strengthening of the Climate Action Advisory Council. The fact that we're actually going to increase it from 11 to 14 members so that we get a much wider berth of experience is really important. The fact that they're actually going to be able to propose budgets to the Minister as well, that's another good example of how we're putting accountability into this legislation. The third thing is, and I actually think this is the most, I find this really important, is the accountability that we're going to give to local authorities, that within 18 months of the enactment of this legislation, every local authority in the country will have to produce a climate action plan. And wouldn't it be wonderful that in a year or two time, if you're a county councillor, you're sitting in your county council meeting, you've always had your director of services for housing, for transport, for planning. Imagine now if in a year or 2 or 3 years or 4 years, we'll have directors of services for climate action who are directly accountable to councillors in local authorities. I think that would be really, really impressive. In my last year as chair of the Special Policy Committee on Planning, we actually introduced a climate action plan for Louth County Council and a whole approach towards a local authority. And now your colleague, Councillor Marianne Butler in Dundalk, actually chairs a dedicated SPC on climate action in Louth County Council. So that's really the way forward that local authorities should be going. And again, we're putting accountability there. The final aspect of how we're doing that is the fact that all ministers are going to be held accountable before the Oireachtas Committee each year, that they will be dragged in front of an Oireachtas Committee and will be held to account to show to basically answer about where they are getting with the targets that have been set before them. And I think that level of accountability is actually really good as well, because it's putting pressure on a minister to achieve those. It's making sure that the targets are set out cannot be just put on the long finger or can be left to sit by the wayside. So I think those are just 4 good examples of how accountability is a cornerstone. Another key cornerstone of this legislation is in the realm of climate justice and just transition. And in climate, the urgency to address climate change in a sustainable and an equitable and a fair way, again, is a very important part of this legislation. It's informed and, most importantly, it's guided by science, and it goes to the very core, I believe, of this bill. And indeed, the definition for climate justice in this legislation itself mirrors very closely the one that was put out by Mary Robinson, the Mary Robinson definition. The idea of a just transition, that also runs through this legislation, and it's critical. It's absolutely critical that we make it as easy as possible for the sectors that need to make those system changes that they need to make, that it's as easy as possible for them. That we're supporting those communities that there may be a perceived negative impact, that we're supporting those communities to make the changes that are required. The new employment opportunities that are here from this as well, coupled with the acknowledgement in the legislation that there must be continuous engagement with communities to support the system changes that I spoke about. And I actually think that is a very key part of the legislation as well, that ongoing communication that so many other members here have spoken about how we have to bring people with us to make sure they're not divided. And I think that ongoing communication that is part of this legislation will go a long way in combating over the next 30 years, as we go towards 2030 and 2050, will go a long way to combating any sort of misinformation, will go a long way to combating any politicians who may want to kick up a fuss about anything along this line for their own political gain. That ongoing communication is really going to reduce the opportunity for anything like that to happen. It's so important that we communicate our policies, that we bring people along with us. And I think once it's explained to people in a simple manner about how we're going to do it, people want to buy into this and they will do so. When we talk about these communities that may be negatively impacted or perceived to be negatively impacted, I think the agricultural community is certainly one of those. They're a good example. But I want to be clear, I really do believe that they have nothing to fear from this legislation. I think they're going to be at the very forefront of this legislation, if I'm being honest. We will all need their advice. We're all going to need their guidance, their expertise in making this just transition actually work. And I've had really good engagement with members of the Louth IFA over the last year about this legislation, about climate action in general. And Senator Dooley mentioned it there before me. It's actually people involved in agriculture have a far better understanding of the task that we actually face, because they see it every single day. They're on their land every single day. They see erosion happening, they see flooding happening. They realise that they realise what's happening, and they want to play a substantial role in it. They want to be at the forefront with the rest of us trying to do it. They're committed to achieving climate improvement, not only just by reducing emissions, but also contributing to carbon removal, which can be done through forestry and the management of soils, etc. The one thing that I would say is, and I want to be clear about this, is the distinct characteristics of biogenic methane will need to be fully considered, I believe, by the Climate Advisory Council. The pace of the reduction in the agricultural sector really does need to be balanced, and it does need to be underpinned by the emerging scientific option and views with regard to methane, namely that it doesn't need to follow the same reduction trajectory as carbon dioxide. So to summarise and to finish up, the point is very clear about this legislation. It's absolutely transformative. It's really ambitious. It's setting an example for other countries that we need to follow as well. The most important thing that runs through it is accountability. There's no point having all of these really great ideas and all these really nice ideas if we aren't making people accountable for it. And accountability absolutely seeps through this legislation. The same as does climate justice, the same as moving towards a just transition, so that we're making sure we're bringing people with us, we're not leaving anybody behind. And it is absolutely something that I am categorically convinced of, that in years to come, future generations are going to look back to this government, to this legislation, and say, in relation to climate action, they got it absolutely right. They stepped up to the plate, they did what was needed to be done, and we are now reaping the benefits 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years in advance because of this legislation today.